She had been grinding since before the stars faded. Her hands, raw at the knuckles, pressed against the basalt stone the way her mother had pressed, and her mother's mother before that, pushing forward, pulling back, pushing forward again, turning barley into flour in the cold dark of a room so small she could touch every wall without standing up. The sound of it filled the house, that low, rasping hum of stone against grain, and outside the door she could hear the same sound rising from every dwelling on the hillside, a chorus of women's labor drifting through Nazareth before the sun had even touched the ridge above the valley. It was the sound of the world continuing. The prophet Jeremiah had written that when this sound ceased, everything would be over, the joy of bride and groom silenced, the light of the lamp extinguished, the grinding at the mill gone quiet. And he was right. Because this sound, this grinding, was the heartbeat of civilization, and it belonged entirely to women. The room where she worked measured barely 2.5 meters by 3. Archaeologists would find one just like it beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent 2,000 years later, carved directly into the limestone bedrock, a single chamber where a family of 6 or 8 ate and slept and breathed together alongside their animals, goats pressing warm against the far wall, chickens scratching near the doorway. The quern she bent over weighed as much as a child, 15 to 25 kilograms of volcanic stone worn smooth by 10,000 repetitions. She would grind for 1 to 2 hours, producing enough coarse flour to bake the day's bread in the taboon oven outside, a clay dome no taller than her knee, fired not with wood, because wood was scarce in the Galilean hills, but with cakes of dried animal dung mixed with straw. She would slap the dough against the oven's inner wall and pull it free in 2 or 3 minutes, flat and blistered and smelling of smoke. 10 loaves, 15. Enough for a household. And then the rest of her day would begin. This was not poverty. This was ordinary life. This was what being a woman meant. The Mishnah, that great compilation of Jewish oral law, lists her duties with the precision of a foreman cataloguing shifts at a factory: grinding grain, baking bread, washing clothes, cooking food, nursing children, making beds, working in wool. If she brought servants into her marriage, each servant absorbed one task, but even a woman wealthy enough to bring 4 servants was still required to work in wool and to manage the household. There was no exemption, there was no retirement. The wool never ended, the bread never lasted past the day it was baked, and the children never stopped being hungry. After the grinding and the baking came the water. In Nazareth, there was only one spring. One. Every woman in the village walked to the same source, carrying ceramic jars that weighed 3 to 5 kilograms empty and close to 20 full. The round trip could stretch to 3 kilometers depending on where your family's dwelling sat on the hillside. You carried the water on your head or your hip, and you did it every day, sometimes twice a day. And the path to the spring was the closest thing to freedom you would experience between the walls of your house and the walls of your grave. But here is the thing most people miss about that walk. The spring, the one we now call Mary's Well, was not just a water source. It was the social center of female life. It was the one place where women gathered without the supervision of fathers or husbands, where news traveled, where grief was shared, where a young girl about to be betrothed might hear from an older woman what to expect. The spring was the women's world in miniature, and it existed because a basic biological need, water, required their daily presence in a common space. God, it seems, had hidden a gathering place inside a chore. He had buried community in the middle of labor, and she would have needed that community, because the legal structure surrounding her life was total. The Mishnah states it with devastating clarity. A father owned his daughter's labor. He owned whatever she found. He held the right to annul her vows. And when she married, these rights did not dissolve. They transferred. from father to husband, seamlessly, completely, like a deed passing between owners. At no stage in her life was a woman in first-century Judea legally autonomous, not as a child, not as a wife, not as a widow, unless she fought for it with extraordinary will. The economic architecture was even more stark. The Hebrew word betula, virgin, was not merely a description of sexual status. It was a price tag, a marriage contract specifying a bride as betula entitled the father to a bride price of 200 zuz. A widow or divorcee commanded 100. A woman's economic value to her family was literally determined by whether she had been touched by a man. Her worth was measured in the negative, in what had not been done to her body. And this was not hidden or shameful. It was written into contracts, argued in courts, codified in law. Girls entered this system young, heartbreakingly young. The Mishnah defined puberty at 12 years and 6 months, determined by the appearance of 2 pubic hairs. A physical inspection could be conducted to verify readiness. Once verified, a girl could be betrothed. The betrothal erusin was legally binding as marriage. Divorce proceedings would be required to dissolve it. The consummation, the nisuin, might not occur for another year. But in the eyes of the law, the girl belonged to a man from the moment the contract was signed. She was 12. She was legally a wife. And the stone in her house still needed grinding. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, wrote it plainly. The woman, says the law, is in all things inferior to the man. Let her accordingly be submissive, not for her humiliation, but that she may be directed. For the authority has been given by God to the man. This was not offered as cultural commentary. It was presented as theology, as divine mandate, as the way God intended things to be. And Philo of Alexandria, that brilliant Jewish philosopher, went further still. He wrote that a respectable woman should not leave the house except to go to the synagogue, and even then only at an hour when the marketplace was empty. The ideal woman's world, in his vision, was bounded by the inner door of her own home. The outer world was not hers to walk in. And if she was suspected of unfaithfulness, not proven, merely suspected, she faced the ritual of sota. A priest would mix dust from the tabernacle floor into water, pronounce curses, and make her drink. If guilty, her body would turn against her. Her abdomen would swell, her thigh would waste away. No equivalent trial existed for men suspected of the same act. The asymmetry was not accidental, it was structural. The system of sexual accountability applied in one direction only, and it bore down on the bodies of women with the full weight of sacred authority. Tell me, when you read the Gospels, when you hear the stories of Jesus moving through Galilee and Judea, have you ever stopped to feel the world he was moving through? Not the architecture, not the politics, the weight on the women's shoulders, literal and legal and spiritual, pressing them toward the ground every single day. Because you cannot understand what Jesus did unless you understand what already existed when he arrived. Consider this. The Talmud records that a man should not speak with a woman on the street, not even his own wife, and certainly not another man's wife. The Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, speaking in the generation immediately after Jesus, declared that whoever teaches his daughter Torah, the Holy Scriptures, the Word of God, might as well teach her obscenity. That was mainstream opinion. That was the respectable position. A woman's mind was not considered a vessel fit for sacred truth. Now hold that in one hand, and in the other hold this, Luke chapter 10, verse 39. Mary sat at the Lord's feet. That phrase, at the feet of, was technical language. It was the posture of a rabbinic disciple. Paul used the identical construction when he described his own education at the feet of Gamaliel. When Mary sat at Jesus' feet, she was assuming the position of a student of Torah. And Jesus, in a culture that said teaching a woman was equivalent to teaching obscenity, accepted her there. He did not ask her to leave. He did not redirect her to the kitchen. When Martha complained that Mary had abandoned her domestic duties, Jesus replied that Mary had chosen the better portion, and it would not be taken from her. The weight of that sentence could crack stone. In a world that defined a woman's worth by her virginity, her fertility, and her labor at the quern, Jesus looked at a woman sitting in the posture of a scholar and said she had chosen the better thing, not the acceptable thing, not the tolerable thing, the better thing, the one thing worth choosing. And this was not an isolated moment. This was a pattern, a deliberate, repeated, scandalous pattern. At the well in Samaria, Jesus spoke to a woman who was alone at midday, an hour that itself suggested shame, since respectable women drew water in the cool of morning. She was Samaritan, which meant a Jew was not supposed to share a vessel with her. She had been married 5 times and was living with a man who was not her husband, which meant she was publicly known as a woman of questionable character. And Jesus sat at the well and asked her for a drink, and then offered her living water, and then told her everything she had ever done, not to condemn her, but to reveal himself to her. John records that the disciples returned and marveled. The Greek word is ithomazon. They were astonished. Not that Jesus was at the well, that he was talking to a woman. He had violated 3 taboos at once: gender, ethnicity, and moral reputation. And he did it at a well, the ancient meeting place of brides and grooms, the place where Isaac found Rebekah and Jacob found Rachel. The symbolism was not accidental. The God of Israel was meeting a broken woman at a well, and the offer he was making was not water. Do you see the design? Do you see what was happening? In a legal system that forbade women from testifying in court, Josephus states explicitly that women could not serve as witnesses on account of what he called the levity and boldness of their sex. Jesus chose women as the first witnesses of the resurrection. Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, the most legally invalid witnesses in the entire culture, entrusted with the most important testimony in the history of the world. This was not oversight. This was statement. If you wanted people to believe your story in first-century Judea, you would choose men as witnesses. If you wanted people to know that God does not operate by human hierarchies, you would choose exactly the witnesses Jesus chose. The tomb was the courtroom, and the inadmissible witnesses delivered the verdict that changed everything. But these women were not only witnesses, they were patrons. Luke records it precisely. Mary Magdalene, Joanna the wife of Chuza, who managed Herod's household, and Susanna supported Jesus' ministry out of their own means. The Greek phrase ek ton hyperkonton ote specifies personal resources. These women were not channeling their husband's wealth. They controlled independent assets, and they chose to deploy them in funding an itinerant rabbi who was overturning every assumption their world was built on. In a culture that transferred all economic rights from father to husband, these women had somehow secured financial autonomy, and they spent it on the kingdom of God. And they were not the first to do so. The thread runs all the way back. Ruth, a Moabite widow with no legal standing, no family protection, no claim on any inheritance in Israel, walked onto a threshing floor in the middle of the night, uncovered the feet of a man named Boaz, and proposed marriage. The Hebrew word for what she uncovered, marjalotav, his feet, carries a charge that the English translation sanitizes. In Hebrew, feet is frequently a euphemism, the same word used in passages where the meaning is unmistakably sexual. Ruth was making a bold, sexually charged proposal to a man she had chosen. She was not waiting to be selected. She was not being transferred. She was acting with initiative that the law did not grant her and the culture did not expect of her. And God honored it. He placed her in the genealogy of David. He placed her in the genealogy of Christ. The outsider woman who broke protocol became the great-grandmother of the king and the ancestor of the king. Deborah sat under a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel and held court. She judged Israel. When the general Barak was commanded to mobilize 10,000 troops against the Canaanite army, he refused to go without her. So she went. She was simultaneously the judicial authority and the de facto military commander of the nation, a position no other woman and remarkably few men ever occupied. And Jael, another woman, finished the battle Deborah began. She drove a tent peg through the temple of the Canaanite general Sisera with a workman's hammer, tools that Canaanite women used every day to pitch camp. She weaponized her domestic expertise. The instruments of her daily labor became the instruments of Israel's deliverance. Hannah stood in the tabernacle at Shiloh and prayed so silently that the priest Eli assumed she was drunk. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. This was so unusual in the ancient world that a priest, a man whose entire life was spent in the presence of worship, could not recognize it. Silent prayer was virtually unknown in ancient Israel, and a woman pioneered it. The practice that would become the foundation of Jewish and Christian devotion, the quiet conversation of the soul with God, began with a grief-stricken woman whose lips moved in a sanctuary where no one understood what she was doing. She was not performing for an audience. She was speaking to the only one who could hear. Her prayer, recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 2, became the template for another prayer spoken 1,000 years later by another woman who had received an impossible promise about a child. Mary's Magnificat, "My soul magnifies the Lord," echoes Hannah's prayer phrase by phrase, theme by theme, revolution by revolution. Both women sang of God lifting the lowly and scattering the proud. Both women held in their bodies a child who would change the course of history. The thread between them is unbroken. And Mary herself, consider the journey. Nazareth to Bethlehem, 150 kilometers, 90 miles, and she walked it or rode a donkey at 4 kilometers an hour for 5 to 7 days in the final stage of pregnancy. Luke says she was pledged to be married. The Greek participle mnemstumein technically indicates the marriage was not yet fully consummated. She was visibly pregnant before the formal completion of her marriage. In a culture where a woman's economic value was determined by her sexual history, Mary's condition was not merely inconvenient. It was dangerous. It invited the kind of suspicion that could trigger a public divorce, a destroyed reputation, or worse. And she traveled anyway. She carried the Son of God in a body that her neighbors would have had reason to doubt, through hills and valleys and nights on the open road, to a city where no one was expecting her. The strength that required is almost impossible to imagine from the comfort of distance. I want you to stop here for a moment and truly feel the texture of these women's lives. Imagine waking in a room where you can hear the goats breathing. Imagine the cold of the stone floor before dawn. Imagine bending over a quern that weighs more than a toddler, grinding in the dark, knowing that the bread you make will be eaten by noon and the grinding will begin again tomorrow. Imagine carrying water on your hip from the only spring in town, your hands cracked, your back aching, your legal identity absorbed entirely into your father's or your husband's name. Imagine being told that your mind is unfit for sacred knowledge, that your testimony is inadmissible, that your worth is a number written into a marriage contract based on the condition of your body. And then imagine someone looking at you, truly looking past all of it and saying, "You have chosen the better portion, and no one will take it from you." That is what Jesus did, again and again, not with speeches about women's rights, not with legal reforms or political manifestos, with presence, with attention, with the radical act of treating women as fully human in a world that had built elaborate systems to ensure they were not. The evidence survives in unexpected places. At Magdala, the hometown of Mary Magdalene, Franciscan archaeologists uncovered a first-century synagogue containing the Magdala stone, a carved block bearing the earliest known depiction of the temple's seven-branched menorah outside Jerusalem. But they also found something else, a prosperous fishing and fish salting center with evidence of significant female economic participation. Women processed fish, women traded goods. The town that produced Christianity's most famous female witness was a place where women worked, earned, and contributed to an economy that the legal texts said they had no right to control. And then there was Babatha. Her archive of legal documents, discovered in the Cave of Letters near the Dead Sea, dates to 93 through 132 AD, barely a generation after Jesus. Babatha owned date palm orchards. She engaged in litigation. She managed property. She navigated a legal system designed to deny her autonomy, and she carved out real economic agency within it. Her documents are not records of submission. They are records of a woman fighting, strategizing, and winning in a world that told her she could not. Lydia of Thyatira dealt in purple cloth, a luxury so extravagant that Tyrian purple dye, extracted from murex snails, cost 10 to 20 times its weight in silver. She was one of the wealthiest independent merchants mentioned in the New Testament, and her house in Philippi became the first church in Europe. The European church was born in a woman's home, funded by a woman's wealth, sheltered under a woman's roof. Phoebe is called diakonos in Paul's letter to the Romans, the same Greek word used for male church leaders throughout the New Testament. Paul also names her prostatis, a term that in the Greco-Roman world designated a patron, a benefactor, a person of legal standing who sponsored and protected others. This was not a courtesy title. This was a woman wielding institutional authority in the early church. And Priscilla, named before her husband Aquila, in 4 of the 6 times the pair appears in the New Testament. In Greco-Roman literary convention, the name that appears first indicates the person of greater prominence or higher social status. It was Priscilla, alongside Aquila, who corrected the theology of Apollos, a learned Alexandrian scholar. A woman instructed a man in doctrine, and Paul recorded it without apology. The pattern is unmistakable. From Genesis to Revelation, the thread runs unbroken. God concealed power in the people the world dismissed. He placed revelation in the mouths the courts would not hear. He built his church on the shoulders of women who were told their shoulders were only fit for water jars. Do you remember the word used for Eve in Genesis? Ezer kenegdo. Your translation probably says, helper suitable for him. But the word Ezer, helper, appears 21 times in the Old Testament. In 16 of those instances, it refers to God himself. The Lord is my Ezer, the psalmist writes. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. The word does not mean assistant. It does not mean subordinate. It means the one who rescues, the one whose strength arrives at the moment of desperate need. When God called Eve an Ezer, he was using the word he reserved for himself. The very first woman was named with the vocabulary of divine power. And we missed it. For centuries, we read helper and heard servant. We read suitable and heard secondary. The Hebrew was saying something enormous, and the translations made it small. Perhaps that is the deepest pattern of all. God hides his most revolutionary truths in the places the powerful do not think to look, in stables, in tombs, in the testimony of women. The woman who had been bleeding for 12 years had spent everything she had on physicians. The Talmud records the remedies available to her, carrying the ash of an ostrich egg in a linen cloth, drinking wine mixed with rubber and alum, one desperate pseudo-scientific treatment after another. 12 years, every coin, every hope. And then she touched the edge of a garment in a crowd, and the bleeding stopped, and Jesus turned and said, "Daughter," not woman, daughter. He gave her a family name in a world that had made her untouchable. That single word, daughter, carried more legal, social, and spiritual weight than any contract written in any court in Judea. The contracts measured her in zuz. Jesus measured her in belonging. This is the testimony the evidence leaves. Not that the ancient world was uniquely cruel, every ancient civilization constrained women, but that into this specific world, with these specific constraints, documented in these specific legal texts, a man from Nazareth walked and behaved as if none of it applied, not by arguing against the system, by simply refusing to see through its categories. He saw people where the law saw property. He saw students where the rabbis saw scandal. He saw witnesses where the courts saw disqualification. And the women saw him back. They followed him. They funded him. They stood at the cross when the male disciples had fled. They arrived first at the tomb. They announced the resurrection to a world that would not legally accept their word. And their word outlasted the empire that dismissed it. I want to leave you standing at that tomb. It is early, the sun has not risen, the stone has been moved, and the linen wrappings lie folded, and the body is gone. And a woman is weeping in the garden because she thinks someone has taken him away. And then a voice says her name, just her name, Mary, and she turns, and she sees. In a world that said her testimony meant nothing, she became the first voice to declare that death had been defeated. The first gospel was preached by a woman in a garden, and the audience was the empty air. And the message was, I have seen the Lord. Tell me in the comments, is there a woman in your life, in your family, in your memory, whose quiet faith carried everything? Whose grinding and baking and carrying and praying held the world together while no one was watching? Because that is the story the Bible tells when you read it closely. Not that women were footnotes in the history of God's people, but that they were the spine, the unbroken thread, the voices that prayed when the priests could not recognize prayer, the hands that funded the church before there was a church, the witnesses God chose when he wanted to say something so important that he entrusted it to the people the world trusted least. The sound of grinding has not ceased. It has simply changed form. In every home where a woman rises before the sun and bends her back to the day's labor and lifts her voice to a God who has always heard the ones the world refused to hear, the ancient sound continues. And it is not the sound of servitude, it is the sound of a world being sustained by the strength the powerful never thought to measure. God's word for that strength was Ezer, the same word he used for himself. If this journey through the lives of biblical women has opened something in you, I invite you to walk with us further. Subscribe, because the stories ahead are just as deep, just as surprising, and just as close to the heart of everything we believe. We have only turned the first stone. Beneath it, an entire world is waiting.